All right, good morning. Hey, Tom, how are you?
I'm good. How are you?
Oh, doing good. Sorry for the confusion this morning.
No problem.
Blackboard normally just automatically releases stuff um, when the courses start, and so this is a first for me to have to actually release the course on the first course day. So uh, we live, we learn, I guess, right? All right, let me get this baby turned on. Make sure I don't have other people waiting on me. So, Tom, I think you're the only one in the waiting room. We have three here in class. And I know that there's some work conflicts that come along with this class time. So everyone knows I will record all of the lectures. So if you need to go back to them, you can go back to them. If you have to miss one, that's understandable. This is the summer, and that's how it goes sometimes. But I love this class. It's quick. Um, it's enjoyable for me. I hope it's enjoyable for you. And the content I think is pretty interesting and applicable. So my hope is that this will be a great experience for you, and you'll learn a lot, even though we're going to be working through the material in a pretty short amount of time. All right, so I want to do some things this morning. I'm going to kind of start off with this about this class slide. I'll probably toggle between this and the syllabus. In addition to just kind of setting the stage for what we're dealing with this summer, I also want to give you guys a chance to talk a little bit about where you're at, what you hope to get from the course. I love learning about what's going on in your PhD programs, regardless of whether it may be classwork or research projects. So just kind of getting on the same page with regards to some of this stuff, I think will be a lot of fun. I'll go ahead and tell you guys just a little bit about me, and that'll give you an example of what I might be looking for when it's your turn to say hello to the group. So, Chris Browning, right? Personally, been married for 20 years this summer. Pretty excited about that. I'm really excited that my wife could endure all that goes along with being married to me for 20 years. My children are a lot like me, and so she's just getting hit from every angle with a whole lot of Browning genetics and the good and the bad that come along with that. I have three kids, so I have a son that turns 16 on Sunday. That's awesome. I think there's going to be a lot of good and bad that comes along with that. I'm really excited for him to be driving, and I'm really terrified for him to be driving. And I can tell you where to go and where to avoid if you're interested, because I hope I know where his path most likely will be in town, but we shall see when he gets the freedom. My daughter is 14. She'll be going into high school next year. Grant goes to Lubbock Christian just down the street. And then my daughter's going to go to Liberty High School on the complete opposite side of town. So thank goodness that one of them can drive. And with my two high school kids, I also have a son that's fixing to finish kindergarten. As he would tell you for the second time, he was not happy about that, but he'll be going into first grade next year. On the academic side, I've been at Tech. This concludes my 12th year at Texas Tech University. I did my PhD here. Before doing my PhD, I got a master's and bachelor's in accounting at West Texas A&M University. And so I've kind of always been in this financial services world in terms of education and experience. No practical financial planning experience, but a couple of years of practice in the public accounting industry, doing both tax and audit. That was a long time ago. Research-wise, historically speaking, I've always done my research on retirement, how people think about retirement, with a specific focus on spending decisions. Been always very interested in how people bring down that portfolio, less from a technical perspective of how should we construct that portfolio to maximize portfolio efficiency, and more about, even if we do that, what might be the roadblocks to people spending according to plan, to maximize satisfaction in line with goals. I'm really excited. I'm fixing to submit some abstracts to both AFS and the FPA conference on the science of hiring good financial planners. And so kind of looking at a practical / theoretical piece on just the idea of how do you identify good talent that both represents the needs that you have with your firm, but also increase the likelihood of long-term good culture hires for what you're trying to do. So that'll be a completely different direction for me. And I'm excited about it. That's always been part of my teaching responsibilities and my service role at Tech is working with students and employers, both in internship positions and full-time positions. And so hopefully those will get picked up for presentation and we can present something cool that the planning community will find valuable through that research. Okay. All right. I talked way too much. You guys are more than welcome to talk at least that much. But that's me being a little chatty. Kathy, you want to start us off?
Absolutely. I'm Kathy Coleman. This is my last PhD class. So excited. I take my qualifying exams this summer. I'm a mother of 3. So Dr. Browning, I can relate. My son just started driving about 3 months ago. Oh, yes.
How's it going?
It's going.
It's going well?
Yeah, he got his driver's license like today, tomorrow. I said, you can drive yourself to school.
Yeah.
And we pray.
Yeah, that's about the only thing you can do, I think.
Yeah, it's the same thing as you. My 2 younger children. So my oldest is 16, the second one is 12, and the last one is 10. The last 2 go to different sets of schools.
Mm-hmm.
So one goes one direction, the other one goes the opposite direction. It's been great. For research, I'm still, I think I took the class with you last year. I'm still working on the influence of how students succeed in their education when it comes to understanding their financial well-being, financial literacy, financial health behaviors. And so everything concerning college students and financial matters, that's what I do every single day. I started my new role as the director of Red to Black early this year, but I've been serving as an RA in that position for the last almost 3 years. So exciting that I get to stay in tech.
Yeah.
And raise the kids, and that's where I am.
Yeah, that's awesome. How are the research projects coming?
They're coming. Oh geez, there's a lot.
You feel good about it?
Yes, and I think we shall come see you, Dr. Chimbane. Because I'm focusing mainly on, remember my data set is dated, it's for 2020, but we're trying to replicate the same in Texas Tech. So with the IRB process.
Gotcha.
Yes.
Oh yeah, taking on when you're here though, you know you're gonna be here, you got time.
Oh no, I want to graduate.
I retract that statement. Hurry up and finish.
Thank you, sir.
Yeah, I get it.
All right. I hope to graduate next summer. Hopefully we'll get a good sample when we release the survey this fall.
Cool. Yeah, that's awesome.
Thank you.
Yeah, congrats on the progress.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Yeah, Nick, Kieran, I'm a first year PhD student, so wrapping up the final, I guess the third part of our first year. Yeah, I'm married about 10 years, got 4 children, so 7, 5, 4, and 1.
They need rides.
Sorry?
They need rides. We got you.
Yeah, right. No rides, just need sleep. I haven't had any experience in the personal financial planning world. I've spent the better part of the last 10 years in business intelligence, data analytics. But super passionate about personal finance and kind of everything. And so I wanted to be part of this. And I don't have any research projects yet. I'm just loving what I'm learning.
Yeah.
But I am super interested in saving decisions, and I love how Hirschfield's self future continuity theory. Basically, yeah, the more connected we are to our future selves, the more future oriented decisions we'll be making. So love to learn how to kind of apply that. And I'm really passionate about the FIRE community, if you've ever heard of that, financial independence, retire early. So yeah, I'd love to study that a little bit more and become an expert in that world.
Yeah,
I haven't seen a ton of research kind of on that world yet, so
yeah, that's cool.
yeah.
Very cool. Now, what classes have you taken thus far?
So I mean, just our regular intro, our stats stuff with Dr. Lacombe, regression. What is it? We did this the seminar that just got changed with Dr. Gillimet.
Oh, okay, yeah.
Yeah,
Financial planning, probably,
yeah,
financial planning research.
yeah. What I don't remember what it was called.
Yeah.
But yeah, just so far the basics. I did just pass the CFP exam in
Hey.
March, so yeah, it was busy.
Yeah, a big cohort of people that rocked that exam in March.
Oh yeah, okay.
Yeah, I think there were 5 or 6 of you guys that passed.
Oh really?
Yeah, it was
Great.
a good album.
Yeah.
For Texas Tech PFP.
Okay.
So yeah, congrats on that. That's a big deal.
Thanks.
Yeah, you bet. Thanks, Nick.
The name is Innocent Kumar. This is my second year in the PFP department. My first year, I spent the time taking the leveling courses. For the second year, and I moved into the PhD. I've taken some of the PhD courses. Interest of research. I'm interested in financial advice. I have a paper out there which is in print already on financial advice. I'm interested in the science and the practice of it. How do we leverage it to build the financial capability of people? That is the side I am interested in.
Cool.
Not the side of just people delegating their staff to advisors to take care of. I am thinking advice can be leveraged to build the financial capability of people, and I don't see a lot of research out there on it, and I'm interested in stuff like that. So
Yeah.
So that is where I am. I've taken the courses Nick has taken, but beside what he has taken, I am taking the certificate courses, Professor James.
Okay.
I've taken 3 of them. He's left it 1, so
Okay.
I do have some of the electives
Yeah.
already taken.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
you're busy.
Uh,
No, that's awesome.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm glad you're almost done with that certificate. And you got to have Dr. James for 4 classes. That's a win too. Well, great. Thank you. Tom?
I'm Tom Gilmore. I live in New Jersey, where I'm dialed in from today. I am married, been married for 12 years. We have 1 daughter. She'll be turning 10 this summer. I'm currently working at Northwestern Mutual. I've been there for 12 years too. So as long as I've been married, I've been trying to do math in my head. So yeah, I've been there for 12 years. I work and I've been in the industry. I started as an advisor at Ameriprise Financial, so I've been in the industry for just a little over 20 years now. My role at Northwestern Mutual has been focused on building our proprietary financial planning software. And sort of the reason and motivation for building that software was to better show the intersection of risk products in retirement planning. And so that's where my research interests are. Like Nick, I haven't started any research yet. I'm still finishing up my first year, but looking to do research in how introducing risk products into the retirement planning process can help boost outcomes both financially, but also, and more importantly, I think behaviorally. So.
Yeah, that's awesome. Well, you're speaking about my love in my research areas. You read Wade Fowle stuff?
Yes, Wade Fowle, Michael Finka.
Yeah. So Michael was my dissertation chair.
Oh, really?
Wade was on my dissertation committee.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, man. When you start talking about those things, I've been brainwashed by the best. And I agree with them, by the way. So No, good stuff. I'll never forget on that topic. And some of you guys have probably heard this story, but for some of you it'll be new. Harold Levinsky was sitting in my dissertation defense. So Harold, in probably 2014, Wall Street Journal comes out, Godfather of financial planning. I'll finish that tagline here in just a second. In 2011, I'm defending my dissertation and going over all this stuff, and it had a lot to do with the cognition of older Americans and how that impacts the way they view risk and how that impacts ultimately the way they potentially spend their money for a nest egg that they've fallen in love with. And so we're talking a lot about annuities and different things like that. And Harold raised his hand and was like, so you're telling me that I should tell my clients who are paying me 1% assets under management that the way that I'm going to manage their portfolio is by buying a product that returns a subpar return in comparison to everything else I could do with their money. And I went through the reasons as to why I thought that might still be a good idea, despite his objections. 2014, the godfather of financial planning speaks about the importance of annuities in retirement portfolios. And in 2014, my office was next to Harold's. And I read that and I went over and knocked on Harold's door. I was like, dude, you grilled me, man. You massacred me on this deal. And he laughed, and the next day brought me a very nice bottle of wine. I was like, I don't think I could have this on campus, but thank you very much. I appreciate it. You know, but lots of fun, lots of advancements on those topics due to some really great research by some really smart people. So very cool stuff. All right. Well, thank you guys for sharing. We'll definitely have to pick up Brandon and, oh my goodness, the last person in our class. Don't be mad at me for forgetting because we've already emailed. We have one other person online. We'll look it up and I'm going to come back after the break and I'm going to give you a shout out. But we have a couple others that we did get to hear from. Hopefully at some point in time during the semester they'll be able to jump on and tell us a little bit more about themselves. All right. So let's jump in and let's talk just a little bit about this class. Okay, so when you think about how this class is going to lay out, it's going to be laid out in two parts. Okay, so we're going to have basically a 5-part lecture series, followed by a midterm. Okay, and all your lectures are currently available on Blackboard. If you want to go check out those PowerPoints, they're super boring, all black and white, just like this one. But the content is there. All right. Once we get through those 5 lectures, you'll take a midterm, which is a take-home midterm. I'll give you 24 hours to complete that midterm. There's about, I'll be somewhere between 15 and 20 short answer questions on that midterm, and I want you to do really well. So I don't mind you thinking through your responses. I don't mind you using your notes. That's a good way to really solidify learning, in my personal opinion, as we go through this process, as opposed to cram, take the exam, forget. If you have to be thoughtful and you have time to be thoughtful in getting your responses, I think it's productive.
You said there's how many questions?
Somewhere between 15 and 20 is kind of where we'll land, probably.
And it's all like a written response or something?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And then we'll go into a presentation section of the class. And so I have some assigned readings that we'll take a look at in the syllabus if you haven't seen them yet. And through those readings, you guys will come and make presentations. And those readings will be very closely connected to the content that we discuss in the first half of the class. And then once we get through student presentations and discussion of research on some of these topics, then you guys will do your final exam that, in my opinion, is very closely set up to mimic what your qualifying exam questions are going to look like. In both the midterm and the final, I tried to replicate the look of a qualifying exam. Okay, you'll have 4 or 5 questions on your final. They're all 400 to 500 word responses where you're using the literature and the content from the course to justify your response and defend your response to the questions. Okay. And so that's how the class is set up. It's not overwhelming. We're done in like 10 days in terms of presentations and lectures. I give you 3 or 4 days to do the exam because it takes a while. And then we're good. So we're going to start, like I said, with that lecture, which is an introduction to basic policy analysis and the theory that goes along with that. And we'll take an exam. Then we'll read and present some of the academic literature. Then we'll take midterm 2. Now, presentations. I'm just going to be honest with you. Some of the articles are shorter and some of the articles are longer, right? And so some of you guys are going to get a good random draw, and some of you guys are going to be like, I got cheated on this random draw. But all of the papers are important. Here's what I would say. If you get a shorter paper, it doesn't mean I need less of a presentation from you, right? That might mean that you might have a little bit more of a gap to fill in terms of surveying the literature and context of the paper that you've been assigned and really beefing up your presentation. Now, these research papers aren't empirical research papers, right? Some are theoretical in nature. I'm not looking for a reconstruction of the mathematical models that the authors use to build the theories that they're discussing inside these papers. I'm looking more for an understanding of the concepts presented in these papers and how to apply those concepts in a research setting by observing the author's perspective on the topic. Okay, so if you get one that feels like it's dense from a mathematical perspective, don't freak out. That's not what I'm looking for. Okay, I want you to understand the basic constructs. Side note on that, the better you are at taking the complex and deconstructing it down to something simple, the better your understanding. Okay? And so when you're looking at that stuff, I'm not telling you like, oh, Dr. Browning said I didn't have to do a recreation of the mathematical model, and so I'm just going to skip this part, right? What I'm telling you is just take a little bit of time, but take the time from the appropriate perspective and say, okay, from a mathematical perspective, I don't necessarily need to understand how to solve this problem, but I need to understand what the author is trying to communicate by the way he set this model up or she set this model up so that I can better understand the overall theory. Okay? And so really just spend a little bit of time saying, all right, can I explain this to my teenage child, to my spouse, to my friend, whatever the case may be? Can I explain for that? Oh yeah, that makes sense. And if that's the case, that's a pretty good level of understanding. And that's the level of presentation that I would want from you on those types of topics. Okay, so looking at about 45 minutes per presentation, and that can include the Q&A associated with the presentation. So if your presentation is somewhere in the ballpark of 35 to 45 minutes, then that gives us enough capacity to do 10 minutes of Q&A, move on to the next presenter, and be in good shape. Now, I put how many slides I would have in a 45-minute presentation. That's not necessarily how many slides you'll have in a 45-minute presentation, but everybody always asks me, how many slides are you looking for? Not a certain number, right? Here's what I am looking for, is in your slides, I would like for you to build something like you presenting it to an audience, okay, that cares. And so this wouldn't be a typical conference presentation, but that doesn't necessarily mean that we can't approach this like we would be presenting it to an academic or practitioner audience at a conference. How would that audience like to consume this information? I'll tell you how they don't want to consume it. In tiny print, in screenshots that you can't read with fuzzy letters, just to be like, I got everything in there, right? It's not about getting everything in there, right? It's about effectively communicating what you're trying to communicate to the people that are listening to. Okay. If you don't like the comparison to a conference presentation, 45 minutes is probably more like what you'll do in a job market presentation, right? And so how can I take this and break it down in enough detail where my job market audience can really understand where I'm coming from, right? In a nice, clear, and clean way. Okay? So approximately 45 minutes. And again, I will probably do about 10 minutes of discussion. Just because you're not assigned a particular article doesn't mean that you don't need to read that article. So just make sure you're staying on top, and that will make our discussion a whole lot more robust. Now, there's a lot of reading, right? If you're looking at the length of this course and the number of pages associated with the articles assigned, like I understand what's realistic and what's not realistic. I don't expect you to read every word on every page of every paper. What I do want you to do is read for context and understanding, right? If you have context and understanding, when somebody takes it a little bit deeper, you'll have enough to bring to the table to ask good questions or to add good insight based on the content being presented. Okay. Some of you guys will definitely enjoy the opportunity of going beyond the assigned article. Some of you guys will be like, I'm having a hard time just getting the assigned article in what I feel like is going to be a 45-minute presentation. So it's super what presentation will be 30% of the grade. Okay. And in addition to the presentation, what I would like for you guys to do is put together a 2-page outline of the article that you're doing. Okay. For those of you that have had me in class before, specifically in a PhD class, you know I love outlines. I think outlines are a really good way to organize your thoughts around the most important content that you're trying to communicate, whether it be in a written paper or in an oral presentation. Outlines, in my opinion, are really, really effective. This is something that Dr. Houston really emphasized when I was going through my PhD, and I learned this skill set from her. And so I try to pass it on under the belief that it's valuable. Kathy's done some outlines.
Will you walk us through in the future what that looks like or needs to look like, or are you just saying?
Yeah, I mean, this is going to be a messed up example because all of your papers are going to look very different here. But if I was doing this in a research paper, I would start with the why I care or why you should care, right? And so I would have just a section that was 100 words on why anybody should care about what we're looking at here. And then I have a section on what question am I answering, right? So I'm going to look at this topic. This is why people care about the topic. In relation to that topic, what question am I answering that adds to the existing body of knowledge? Okay. Then I have a section on most relevant literature, right? So how am I placing my question and how am I justifying my question? So I'm basically saying, hey, listen, there's a hole in the literature and I'm placing it and I'm justifying my question as important based on what's been done in the past, and equally as important, what hasn't been done yet. Okay, so I just have a little section on that. Then I would have a section on the theory that I'm going to use to center my question around. Right, so this is the lens that we're going to view this topic through. And so with good theory, I can have good hypotheses. So I just list out whatever my hypothesis or hypotheses are. I don't want to contradict something that everybody else is teaching you guys in this program, but I'm going to give you my opinion on this. I'll see a research paper and be like, here is my list of 12 hypotheses. Like, this feels like more than one paper, right? I don't know that any one paper needs 12 hypotheses. right? I don't need that any one paper needs 4. And so if I'm working on my outline, I would encourage you to start with 1, right? One of the hardest things you're going to figure out to do is narrowing your stuff to be super narrow. When I've got 6 hypotheses, chances are decent that I am not starting my project with a very narrow focus. So start with 1. And then after you start with that 1, if you feel like, hey, listen, as I go through this process, the addition of 1 or 2 more hypotheses is very justified to really add some robustness to my paper, then do it. Don't start there. All right, that's my soapbox, and that's my opinion. If somebody else is giving you a different opinion, then by all means, certainly consider their opinion as well. So once I have my hypotheses, again, I'm going to let my theory guide my model. I'm going to let my literature guide my model, right? Theoretically speaking, what should be included in my model, with a specific focus on the dependent and independent variable. How should the dependent and independent variable be constructed so that I can get at the question that I'm trying to answer? And what are the other inclusions in my model that are really going to help me control and isolate for the effect that I'm trying to observe? Okay, so I'm just going to list out, this is my model, this is my dependent variable, this is my independent variable, here's how they're constructed, here are my theoretical controls that need to be accounted for in this model. Okay, and then about another 100 words on what I expect to find and how those expected findings are valuable. Your life would be so much easier writing papers if you'll start there, because it's your map moving forward. Now, that doesn't mean that sometimes there's not road construction and you don't have to reroute the map, right? But at least you're identified a starting place. You've identified the destination, and you've put together a route that you feel like is an efficient route to get from point A to point B. Now, once you start traveling the road, again, there may be things that come up that speak to the efficiency of that route, and you may have to make some adjustments. More than likely you will. But it'll be a heck of a lot better than being like, all right, I got this question. Let's get started. That's really hard. So,
And just to be clear, I think I'm a little disorganized. We're putting these outlines, is that gonna be within the framework of the presentations you're saying then?
yeah, so that's why I said it's gonna be a bad example, because these papers will not be set up that way.
Right. But that's part of like our grade is we're gonna do the presentation, but we also wanna have an outline that we're gonna submit to you.
Right. And I'm gonna make your presentations and your outlines available to the entire class.
Okay.
And the reason I'm gonna do that is because I want you to have good resources when it comes back to qualifying exams. If you want to come back and look at some of these topics, and I want you to have good resources if you're like, you know what, I'm gonna do a research paper related to some of the theories that we talked about in reg policy. I want to go pull down some summarized information on this stuff from the class. So you'll have the lectures, presentations, the outlines, all that kind of stuff that'll kind of hopefully clarify your thinking. All right, so pretty simple, right? 5 lectures, 3 presentation days, 2 exams, and we're done.
Yeah, the assigned papers, I've looked at some of them, they are highly theoretical. Yeah, so I am thinking about the number 3, the relevant literature. They tend not to focus so much on reviewing the literature. For them, it's about the mathematics, how to come to that equation they are looking at to be able to analyze it.
Yeah,
Yeah, so I don't know whether you understand my question, but
yeah, no, I understand it.
yeah.
So Innocent's question is, hey, listen, some of these papers don't have a ton of literature review in them.
Yeah.
What do we do? What I would encourage you to do if you come across a paper that is very light on literature is go into Google Scholar and look at the papers that are citing that paper, right? And so this is how this theory is being applied. answering this type of question, this type of question, this type of question, and some of the key things that are extensions of the paper that you're presenting on. Feel good about it?
Yeah.
We'll talk more about it. Don't feel like this is the last time we're gonna talk about this topic. All right. Let's start with a little bit of review. Okay, and some of you guys are like, I don't know. And if we ask these questions and you get to a point like, I have no idea what the answer to that is. That's okay. That's what this is here for. But these are just quick hitter questions, right? I'll tell you a story real quick before we get into the first one. Dr. Finka is teaching in the PhD program. There's a kid, not a kid anymore. His name was Will. I can't remember his last name for the life of me for some reason. I'm going to call him Goodwill Hunting. That's about an accurate parallel. Will, again, I can't remember his last name, is a professor of finance at Carnegie Mellon. Very smart. And so whatever everybody else did in 3 hours, Will did in about 30 minutes. He's like, what are you guys doing? So we go through this process. We're taking a midterm exam for Dr. Finka. And I'm grinding. I'm trying to finish in the 3-hour class, right? Will finishes in 45 minutes. He turns his paper in, and Dr. Finka used to always do this thing where he would resubmit like ideal answers to the questions. I'll do the same thing for you guys. Like virtually ideal question answers to the questions. And he took them from the responses that were submitted by the students. And so we could look and be like, oh, there's my answer. That's awesome. So I never found my answers. All of Will's answers were present though. And so he basically just posted Will's exam. And then he posted a few other people that made really good responses to some of the questions. But what was really interesting about Will's responses in comparison to everybody else's is that Will's were about 1/3 to 1/2 the length of everybody else's. They're just perfect, right? He could say what everybody else could say in 250 words in 100 words without missing any of the important content in that 100 words. And so the reason I tell you that is because when we're looking at these questions, I think it's a really good opportunity to practice pretty concise answers. Now, I always say that in this class, and then people will give me one word. And I'm like, well, that's really concise. I don't know if you understand this or not. And so when we're thinking about this, you can think about some of these questions about what's the most efficient way to demonstrate my understanding. And again, I think when you're thinking about your qualifying exams, this approach is really effective, okay? How can I be comprehensive and efficient at the same time? All right, what's the goal of the household? Now that I've freaked you out. Yeah.
To maximize utility given the budget constraint.
Yeah, man. To maximize utility based on available resources, right? So I'm going to allocate my resources in a way that is in line with my goals and preferences in an attempt to accomplish the utility objective, right? Excellent. All right, so this is the answer, right? To maximize happiness over the life cycle. How do we do this? Well, we've already talked about this as well, right? We estimate available resources over the course of our lifetime. Now, this is a part that a lot of people get confused on, I feel like, in relation to this utility maximization problem, because it's really easy to think about the present moment, right? Say, what are my resources today? And based on my resources today, how would I allocate today's resources to maximize utility? Well, if I'm solving the lifetime utility maximization problem, then I have to think about the present value bundled lump sum of my resources and the intertemporal allocation of those resources across time to maximize on this objective. Okay? Now, that sounds really good from a theoretical perspective, but how do we feel about the practical application of this process? Good, right? This is not an easy problem, right? Because everyone has an unknown optimum, maximum lifetime utility given available resources. In other words, we don't know what the future holds, either from a resource perspective or from an allocation perspective, based on the circumstances we're going to face. Okay, so we're thinking about available resources and really thinking comprehensively across time. Here's the resource that we generally consider in this equation. Now, I want to make a quick side jump. I'm not giving you a practical explanation of how to solve this problem, right? I'm thinking more along the lines of, if I was going to set up a research question and I wanted to think about observing people's behavior in comparison to the rational optimal, how can I set up an expectation based on the rational optimal, and how can then I compare against that to see either consistencies or deviations? Okay, and so when we're looking at this stuff and going over this stuff, this again is not me sitting across the table from somebody saying, all right, we need your initial well, we need your present value of human, right? This is me setting up a research paper saying, like, okay, if somebody was rationally doing this and they would consider these things. So the question becomes, if we have a complex problem of estimating available resources over the lifetime and then allocating those resources in a rational way to maximize utility, do we ever reach that max? Oh, look at Kathy's a professional student. You heard her say this is my last PhD class, and the first answer she gives is independent. Excellent. Very good. You're going to make an awesome professor. Right? I would say that's a fair response. What else do you guys think?
In the first place, we don't even know what the maximum is. Yeah. So how do we evaluate to know whether we've hit that maximum or not? Yeah.
Yes.
So again, I think it comes down to the answer Akati gave. I think it's in order. Yeah.
Yeah. There's an ethereal maximum out there. We don't know what it is. We don't know if we've estimated it correctly. We don't know if we're pursuing it efficiently. So the answer, I think, to this question is no. Right? There is an answer to this problem, but nobody ever knows what it is. And so what does that mean? That means we probably have an estimation problem, and that probably means we have an allocation problem that leads us to outcomes that fall short of whatever our maximum is. Right? And our allocation problem can be from complexity, it could be from externalities that create circumstances outside of our control. It can be from bounded rationality, right? Our inability to act perfectly rational for one reason or another. But if you think about the reality of those types of things coming into play, it's very unlikely that we're going to maximize our utility over our lifetime, right? So this is kind of sad. I'm curious. Yeah, go ahead, Tom.
Justin's in the waiting room. He just sent me.
Justin, thank you for letting me know, because I am very bad. All right, so I'm going to let Justin hop on. Justin, how are you, sir?
I've been on Zoom since like 2019. You'd think I know how to unmute myself, but I'm doing great. How are you?
Hey, it's great to see you, and you're in good company, man. I'm going to do all kinds of things that seem pretty counterintuitive to common sense over the course of our time together this summer. So I do my best to make you feel better. And you walked in just the right time, Justin. I'm talking about how sad our inability to maximize our satisfaction is. And I think it's a great opportunity for you to introduce yourselves and bring us back up.
All right. So quick introduction. I'm Justin Gassett, based here in the, I assume an introduction is what you're saying, right?
Yes,
Who
sir.
I am? All right. Sometimes I assume things that aren't true. Anyhow, yeah, based here in the windy and warm Westlake, Texas. Been at Fidelity for a quarter of a century. Been here longer than I haven't. On a personal front, I'm married to my wife, nurse and professor Jen. She's a TCU alumni and professor, teaches at the nursing department. Just graduated with her doctorate degree a week ago last Friday. So now I got to call her Dr. Jen. And they got 3 kids, Julia, Jack, and Jocelyn, from 19 to 12. And then on a personal front or a professional front, best professional, personal. Anyhow, hopefully I'm will be graduated in with my PhD. I have it on my whiteboard May of 2028.
Nice. Heck yeah, man. May of 2028. You're going to graduate with your PhD, which is definitely a lifetime milestone. And my son's going to graduate from high school in May of 2028. I hope that someday he writes PhD on his whiteboard. I just hope he writes college on his whiteboard at this point in time. And I hope a college reciprocates by writing Grant Browning on an acceptance letter. But no, that's awesome, Justin. Glad you could jump on and join us. And really glad to have you in the class.
Thank you.
Yeah, you bet. So yeah, like I was saying, right, it's not likely that we're going to maximize. And Nick was about to ask a question.
Yeah, so I'm always kind of torn as I'm trying to think through the theories. I mean, because if we're talking about life cycle Modigliani, I think, right?
Yeah.
Aren't we saying though that we should assume that we have perfect information or that we know for certainty what the future holds? Like that's anyway.
Yeah. So one of the things that we're going to talk a lot about in this class that's titled Regulatory Policy, right? Sounds terrible, but it's really interesting. Is that one of the things that we're tasked with as researchers in this field is observing deviations from the optimum, right? And so theoretically speaking, you're absolutely right. We're going to assume that people have perfect information, the perfect ability to input and process information to make fully informed, rational decisions, right? Those are going to be our assumptions. And so this rational man, as the original literature would call it, would be able to accomplish this objective based on those assumptions, right? And so what our job is to do is to say, okay, well, that's good, because the outcomes that that person would achieve would be very, very satisfying. But if we are unable to uphold the assumptions as presented, where do the interferences come into play? And what is the consequence of the interference? Okay. And in some cases where the consequences are severe enough from the interference, how might we step in from a regulatory perspective to minimize consumer utility loss? And so that's going to be a big part. Thank you for queuing that up for me with that question. So yeah, that's a great point. All right. So we all could be happier. And so the question is, what limits our ability to maximize utility? We've kind of answered some of this, so you guys fire it back at me.
We are irrational. For example, as much as we want to save for our future, we procrastinate.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
We'll say tomorrow.
Who's done something irrational this week financially?
Sure.
I'll give you an example. I bought and had delivered $400 worth of groceries that represented about two weeks worth of meals. After unloading those groceries, I loaded the family up and went out to eat dinner at a restaurant. Irrational, right? Probably an inefficient allocation of resource based on a behavioral solution to a problem. All right, good. What else?
Don't know how long our life expectancy is.
Yeah, really, really difficult to estimate some of the inputs into this problem, right? What is our life expectancy? What is the rate of return on our financial assets going to be? What is the rate of growth on our income going to be? Right? What is inflation going to be? What are my tax rates going to be moving forward? The list could be really, really long on estimating some of these things that are going to impact the decisions that we make. Good. What else?
I think that the high cost of information or unlimited information, you can't have unlimited information to be able to achieve an optimum level of utility. You will need considerable level of information to be able to do that, but we are limited in terms of the access we have to information. So
Yeah, awesome. Yeah, I mean, information economics is a big part of what we're gonna talk about during our time together, right? Information is costly. I love the way that you put that out there, right? Information is costly. And so we're gonna have a cost benefit analysis that we perform internally that leads to the decisions that we make about the acquisition of information, whether or not to acquire information, how to acquire that information, if we're acquiring information, how much of that information to acquire, and so on and so forth. And that's just getting the information. That's not even using it. There are a lot of people that get crappy information because they can't tell the difference between good information and bad information. Then they use bad information in a decision that leads to poor outcomes. And they never know it. Right? They have an inability to distinguish between high and low quality information, right? Which speaks to two different things. It speaks to our innate human capital, the level of intelligence that we were born with, and our acquired human capital. The human capital that we achieve through experiences and education and so on and so forth, right? So the higher our innate human capital is, the better we're going to do with information, just because that's how God is, right? The more domain specific human capital we have in relation to the decision that we're making, the better decision that we'll make with regards to information and the use of that information to inform how we move forward. Okay, I always like to use the example of if my car breaks down. Right? I remember taking the ASVAB test, which is the military test, aptitude test. Two things on this. When I took it, I decided I was going to go to school to be an accounting major. And so I tried to answer all the questions so that the results came back and said, you should be an accounting major to justify the decision that I made. Well, the test came back and said two things, right? The first one says, you should be a librarian. I was like, I don't think so. I mean, no offense to librarians. I just don't think I should be a librarian. So my bad on the way I answered those questions. I got an inaccurate result. The second one, which was very accurate, is never touch a car with your own hands. It's like you have no aptitude whatsoever to understand the mechanics of how an automobile works. And I'm like, I agree with that. And so when I am making decisions on auto repairs and different things like that, my inability in that domain, my lack of domain specific human capital impacts how I get information, how much information I get, how I use that information, and ultimately the outcome I achieve through that repair. I probably pay too much for repairs that I don't need, if I was guessing. It's because I'm not smart in that department. Okay, so good. You guys hit the nail on the head, right? Information, which we talked about, and then also just our rationality and some of the assumptions and our uncertainty around those assumptions that we have to use. Okay, so how do we get information? Okay, we can spend time collecting it, or theoretically speaking, we could rent someone else's expertise. Okay, and so this speaks back to the cost benefit analysis that we have to do in this information pursuit that we engage with. All right, so if I'm going to become my own expert, and we'll talk about this a lot more in one of the lectures, then there are costs associated with becoming my own expert. Okay, you guys have chosen to get a PhD in financial planning, right? And hopefully at the end of this, if you really wanted to, you could manage your own financial plan for the rest of your life. Right now, Harold Levinsky told another story about this. Daniel Kahneman, I couldn't believe he said this, was one of his clients. Right, Daniel Kahneman, the Nobel Prize winning behavioral economist, right? Pretty smart. And he said, hey, listen, I know enough about behavioral economics. And I assume that I am the person that I write about. And so I'm going to be better off delegating these decisions to an unbiased, unbehavioral person. I don't know if unbehavioral, of course, person to help me make objective decisions in relation to my financial plan. Okay, so even if we can do it, doesn't necessarily mean that we should. Or we can rent the human capital of an expert, which also has a cost. And so the question is, in certain domains, in pursuit of utility maximization, what is the best resource allocation to maximize our outcome? Okay, we'll talk about that. All right, so here's just an example from a reading. And the reading basically says, in an application of what we're talking about here is we'll maximize the income utility from consumption activities each year, which is constrained by the resources that we have. And our knowledge, our information will increase the expected utility from the goods and services that we engage with. Okay, so this is the goal. This is what we're working with to achieve the goal. And if we're pursuing the goal efficiently, then we will experience an increased ability to maximize utility from the decisions that we're making. Okay, so increased decision making ability leads to more efficient decision. That's basically what this says. Now, this is a specific application, right? Which says, hey, listen, if I'm increasing my knowledge to make more informed decisions, well, in a buy decision, I'll buy better stuff at a lower price. I'll buy more efficient. Okay, but we don't necessarily have to be looking at it from this perspective, right? As my knowledge increases, I'll just make more efficient resource allocations. In some cases, it will be. I'll buy the better alternative in the marketplace. Or in some places, it'd be like, I'll say no to that and yes to this because the trade-off is in my favor in terms of my goals. Okay, so what does this mean? That increasing our access to human capital, whether it be our own or someone else's, leads to better financial choice. Okay, so Innocent kind of talks about this, like I want to study the benefits of financial advice, and I don't want people just to get advice, but I want financial advice to increase their capabilities moving forward. Okay, well, good. So if we are able to gain access to better information, then we should be able to make more informed decisions that, again, lead to more efficient resource allocations. All right, I'm going to stop right here. Let's take a 5-minute break. Okay, and then we'll come back and we'll continue our discussion. All right. Oh man, 5-minute break felt great. I need some water. So hopefully you guys feel a little bit refreshed as well. All right, Nick, I'm gonna pick on you. Why do people say?
Oh. Why do people say? I mean, simply so that they can have a better future, self, like they're saving for their future self, future expenses, goals.
Yeah. Awesome. I agree with that completely. All right, now somebody give me a professor answer on why do people say? If I was going to say one sentence, theoretically, this is why people say. Which will be the exact same thing Nick said, by the way.
Well, we save when income rather is high for the periods that we may have lower or no income.
All right, so you're both barking down the right trail. If I have excess income above what I feel like I need to spend today, I'm making a decision, right? I could spend that income today, right? I could. Or I could transfer it to a future period. So what would motivate me not to spend it today and to transfer it to a future period? Again, in a professor raise.
The level of your consumption, right?
Okay, good. And you're all just right there. Smoothing.
Smoothing consumption.
All right, so I would say I'm smoothing my marginal utility from consumption. Now people are risk averse. They like consistency. And so in smoothing the consumption in and of itself, it also aids in smoothing the utility consumption. So there is a difference, right? All right. I'm never going to save $1. I'm never going to save 1 penny unless I think that penny or dollar can provide more satisfaction in the future than it does today. Right? I believe the utility from $1 saved provides more future satisfaction than $1 consumed today, is my only motivation for saving. If I did not believe that were true, I would never save, because it would be inconsistent with my utility maximization objective. Right? I believe alternatively that that same dollar could provide more satisfaction today than I would spend it. Okay, so that's why we say. We've already talked about why financial decisions are complex, so we don't have to go back onto this. But in light of the complexity of financial decision, what types of mistakes do people make financially? Right, just give me some examples that you've read about, you've observed, that apply to your own circumstances.
I would say saving too much in the wrong type of account. For example, oftentimes your clients will maximize their 401ks, which eventually causes them a lot of great saving opportunity, or like great spending opportunities, but also some challenges going forward. So I started talking, I was like, it's probably a bad example, but I see that a lot.
No, I think that's actually a great example, right? Asset location decisions is what I'll call that. People make mistakes in that department for sure, right? What else?
I think overconfidence.
Yeah,
When you think you know so much about a specific industry because you just learned about it, but then you make a decision thinking you know what you're doing and you end up losing quite a bit. So being too confident.
absolutely. Yeah. So we make decisions based on behavioral biases that are costly, and we could extrapolate that onto a bunch of different observations, right? Okay. What else?
We follow the crowd,
Yeah, herd.
right?
Right? We do that a lot. There's like some safety in numbers. We have FOMO. We have all these different things that cause us to do what everyone else is doing. And some people are contrarians. Like, I'm not going with the crowd. I'm going to go against the crowd. And that generally leads to the same types of mistakes in a different form as well. Okay, so we could make a long list of types of mistakes people make, right? I'll go back to my example of retirement, right? When to start saving, how much to save, how to invest those savings, how to reallocate those savings over time, how to distribute those savings in terms of income. I mean, and I'm skipping a bunch of the things that go into that decision. I'm just talking about the big ones. If we mess up even slightly the big decisions, then it can have profound impacts on resource availability and our ability to allocate towards our goals. Okay, so it more likely than not is going to reduce our utility based on the mistakes that we make. But like we said earlier, oftentimes we don't even know that we're messing up, right? And that's a product of imperfect information. If I don't measure the alternatives, then I don't understand the trades that I'm making. If I don't understand the trade that I'm making, I'm more likely to make suboptimal trades and reduce my utility. So who do you think this impacts the most?
Those with least information.
Good. Absolutely, right? This impacts those with the least information or the least ability to use information in the decision-making process. All right, so we just call these people the naive. Okay, so we'll talk a lot from a theoretical perspective about the sophisticated and the naive. Right, the sophisticated have the ability and the information to make good decisions. The naive are lacking something that would be needed to perform well. Okay, so let's just take a look at the consumer problem. A young investor willing to take moderate risk for above average growth would be most interested in which of the investment options: T-bills, money market mutual funds, or a balanced stock mutual fund. Well, we know that the answer to this is a balanced stock mutual fund, right? If we're just looking at this. By the way, this is straight out of a financial literacy survey that Dr. Houston did a few years back when she was heavy in this research. And here's what we see, right? A and don't know, right? They're like, let's take a guess here. The people that chose B saw mutual fund more likely than not. Like that's probably pretty good. But they had no earthly idea when it came to the intricacies of the account type, what they were really looking at. And about 38% of people either knew or guessed right. Right. Now the problem with this is that's C. And so you probably definitely have some guessers in there, like C's always there, right? And so the point is that over 60% of the people did not know the answer to this very basic question. Okay, let's look at another. To ensure that some of your retirement savings will not be subject to income tax upon withdrawal, what would you contribute to? Traditional Roth or a 401k? Okay, well, we know the answer to this is a Roth. Now, interesting observation here is about 38% of the people got the answer right, which maybe gives us some confidence that about the same people are answering these questions correct. And about the same people are answering these basic questions incorrectly. That's an inference. We don't actually know that. But there's some evidence that might be true. Okay.
So you said, when was this question put together?
Oh man, this was probably 10 years ago. That we pulled this out of the survey. And so, yeah, I mean, I could see if you pick C, some people might have Roth IRAs in today's environment, or Roth 401ks, more so now than they would have been. But any level of sophistication would be like, well, I only see Roth on one of these. And so that's what I'm picking. My point here is that there are more people with barriers to making quality decisions then there are people that would fall on the sophisticated side that would likely have what it takes to make improved decisions. Okay, so here's what we can look at here. Now, unfortunately, there's a lot of correlation between income, wealth, education, IQ, and decision making. Okay, so people with higher IQs, educations, incomes, and wealth usually make better decisions. People with lower measures on those metrics usually make less quality decisions. And so it creates a disparity, right? And this speaks to the importance of regulation, right? Left alone, this gap would be massive, right? But regulation comes into play and basically says, hey, listen, if the goal is to maximize utility of a society as a whole, then we have to intervene on behalf of the naive to ensure that they don't constantly end up in situations where their utility is compromised, right? And here's just an example of that, right? Roth ownership by education and IQ. We see that higher levels of education and IQ are heavily positively correlated with higher levels of Roth ownership than the alternative.
Why do you think grad school is less likely than college?
The only thing I can think about with grad school is potentially outpacing the Roth contribution limits from an income perspective.
How you doing?
For those of you that have had me in other PhD classes, specifically research, this is going to be very contradictory to what Dr. Lacombe would tell you, and I'm okay with it. If he tells you something different and you're in his class, do what he tells you to do. But if I'm looking at education, I do not care about a 5-category variant. There's a split. Do you have a college degree or do you not? If you have a college degree, you're more likely to partake in certain behaviors. If you don't, you're less likely to partake in those same behaviors. Now we can look at each level, that's true. But the thing that makes the difference is the college degree.
Separation.
Yeah. So, all right. So what's the problem with knowledge? I'm gonna before we get into this, I'm gonna talk a little bit about what Kathy said earlier. Overconfidence is one of the problems with knowledge. And Kathy knows this from her time in Red to Black and her time with the APF program and how those things intersect. There's a pretty good strand of research that says, hey, listen, more financial literacy education potentially leads to worse decisions. And it's not because people aren't becoming smarter, it's because they're becoming confident at a rate faster than they're becoming smarter. And so they have this inflated confidence in their ability to make quality decisions in complex areas, and they just get after it. All right, so we have to be sure that we're not being overconfident, and we have to make sure that we can measure overconfidence and its impact on decision quality when looking at the consumer and their behavior. All right, so more theoretically speaking, in terms of traditional economics, the problem with knowledge is that information is costly. Okay, and so if we were going to measure this, say how much does information cost, then we would say, well, how much time does it take you to acquire that information, and what are you giving up when you choose to allocate your time towards information acquisition? So the easiest thing to measure in terms of what you're giving up is your wage rate. Okay. This is opportunity cost, right? Time times wage rate is our opportunity cost of acquiring information. Okay, so we will invest time and give up wages if we think the expected benefit of the information that we're acquiring is greater than the cost of that information. Okay. But to make this decision well, we have to know the difference between the outcomes we would experience with and without the information. Right? And so this is where a lot of times shortcuts come into play. Okay, I'll use an example. Yeah, heuristics. I'm thinking about, well, I'm not actually thinking about this, but we'll use this. I have a friend that is a professional crypto trader. All right, when I say professional, that's what he does. I don't know what he's good at. I don't know what anybody's good at. But that's what he does. Side note, ask this friend, what's the most you've ever lost, or what's the most money you've ever made trading crypto in a week? $2.5 million. What's the most you've ever lost trading crypto in a short period of time? $2.5 million. And my follow-up question is, why does your hair look like that? Because it's about this long, male. Good dude. I can pick on him because he's one of my best childhood friends. Curly, I mean, he looks like a barbarian. I was like, dude, cut your hair. He's like, I made a promise to myself that I'm not going to cut my hair until I figure out how to trade crypto in a stable enough way to generate a consistent income for my family. I was like, but you're never cutting it. The next time you make $2.5 million in a week, get the heck out of there and go get a haircut. Anyways. I don't know. And so if I take a shortcut, I'm thinking about investing in crypto. But if I could engage in the process of acquiring costly information in the belief that the expected benefit I achieve from the decision that I make is going to be greater with the information than without, right? Or I could go ask my friend, right? Now, we would call this potentially bringing the human capital of an expert, except I'm not going to pay him. I'm just like, hey man, what are you doing? What do you got going on? He's like, oh man, you got to buy this, or you got to sell this. I'm like, okay, awesome. Now I don't have to worry about acquiring information. I got a tip from somebody that's a supposed expert, and I'm just going to go and make a decision based on that. I didn't know the difference between the present value of lifetime utility with and without quality information, right? If I had accurately measured that, I would probably have taken a different course of action. Okay, so this is an interference with regards to decision quality, because we don't know that. Okay, so another way of saying this is, what utility would I have accomplished from being informed versus being uninformed? Okay, so when should we pay for advice? Right, another way of thinking about this is, when should we regulate? Because the reality is, a lot of people aren't going to have the resources to pay for professional advice under the constructs of the current advice market. Now it is becoming more diverse with regards to people's ability to participate, but still people are going to be priced out of the advice market at some level. Okay, so we would pay for advice, or we would regulate to make sure that we're not creating disparities that are too great between the sophisticated and naive. If the present value of lifetime utility in the presence of advice or regulation is higher, right, is greater than the present value without. By the way, what is the incentive of the sophisticated? The incentive of the sophisticated is to take advantage of the naive. I mean, if we're talking about theoretically speaking, the incentive of the sophisticated is to take advantage of the naive. Now, this happens in a very structured market, the credit card, right? Now, I wouldn't tell you that my reason for getting a credit card is to take advantage of naive credit card users, but it's certainly a benefit, and I enjoy that, right? As I'm sure some of you guys do as well. So the sophisticated credit card user is going to take advantage of interest-free short-term loans. They're going to pay their balance off in full. They're going to have little to no interest charges on that card, and they're going to rack up massive benefits through the rewards programs that credit cards offer. The naive is going to overspend, carry a balance, pay lots of interest, pay penalties over the limit, penalties for late payments, and get very little reward based on how they use that card, right? And so, in other words, the naive is going to pay for the sophisticated benefits. This is Vegas, right? The person that goes to Vegas to enjoy the shows, at some level, is taking advantage of the naive person that is subsidizing the opulence of Vegas by using all their money at the craps table. That's me. I'm okay with it. Not on the credit card side, but on the Vegas side.
I don't know, but I don't know whether it's proper to say the sophisticated. It's through no fault of mine if I am sophisticated. I think we should be blaming the third party, which is the company.
Right.
They are the exploiter, not me, who is the sophisticated customer. I am just being smart. I've made the investment.
Yeah.
And I'm reaping the benefits. So I don't know.
I have no incentive, and you're right. The true sophisticated, more often than not, is the big player in the market, right? The company, the industry. You're absolutely right. Now, as a consumer, I have no incentive whatsoever to interrupt this process. Right? In fact, I would probably do everything in my power if I had input on the outcome to make sure the process as it stands is maintained. Now there's moral issues, ethical issues, but we're not talking about that. Theoretically speaking, that's how the markets function.
See something. I think going back to what you said, and also Innocent, one of the things that John Campbell in Household Finance said is that I think he called it cross subsidy, whereby the naive investor who has no idea will keep investing more and more with the hope of getting returns with zero information. But the sophisticated investor will continue actually earning more from that naiveness of that consumer. And his argument was that no one wants to fix it. The market is very much aware that this is happening and it's wrong, but they say no one wants to fix it because there are those that benefit highly from that lack of information that the naive investor doesn't.
Yeah. So this is a big point in information economics, right? Like I am going to demand information to the point that increased information increases the benefit of increased information outweighs the cost of additional information, right? And so this is the problem you're describing, right? The sophisticated consumer is going to demand information to the point to where the benefit continues to flow. But once information becomes so great, the sophisticated consumer is like,
I'm good.
like we don't need any more information here. Like I've got enough to maximize on this deal. So again, this speaks a lot to the benefit of regulation because this interference is compromising the utility of a specific group in a society. And so how do we level the playing field at some level to where one group isn't experiencing highest levels of satisfaction at the expense of dissatisfaction of another?
I was just thinking of an example where maybe we do take advantage I shouldn't say we as if I'm the sophisticated person, but sophisticated over the naive is, I mean, there's a lot of assumptions going in it, but buying the dip right when the tariff and a lot of retail investors just were selling, and it's like people like Warren Buffett or who have people that have extra money. It's like, well, hey, things just went on sale, and so anyway.
Oh, for sure.
And there's sometimes take advantage of that.
Oh yeah. Yeah, I mean a lot of that. I mean that just all goes back to information, right? Like if I understood, or if somebody that did understand was telling me, like this is a bad idea, right? I'm selling low at the benefit of other parties. Then we probably wouldn't do that, right? If I came to a credit card user and said, "Hey, listen, you want to pay for my vacation?" They'd probably say, "I'm good." But I don't know that I'm going to go out and advertise and be like, "Hey man, keep doing what you're doing, or don't do what you're doing." Because if you stop, then this impacts me. Now, to Innocent's point, they're happy to pass on the rewards. The credit card companies don't want this. Like, hey man, I'm going to benefit one group because the cost of benefiting one group is very low in comparison to the benefit of taking advantage of another.
That's why he invests on value per fund. That's all. It's because if you don't want maximize on it.
Yeah. All right. So, we're asking a lot with regards to this question on paying for advice, right? And it goes back to what we talked about earlier. It's very difficult for us to estimate as consumers the difference in present value lifetime utility in one state versus another. Okay. So again, we're going to talk about cost benefit analysis a lot Okay, so here's some research here. Who uses a financial planner? Now, in the data set that this was pulled out of, the use of a financial planner was very broadly defined, as it is in most secondary data sets. If you're looking at doing research on the impact of a professional financial planner on decision quality of the consumer, I don't know, your best is probably the NFCS, right? But there's others that kind of beat around this bush. All right, but this again just basically shows that the people that have the highest levels of sophistication. Now here we're looking at wealth quintiles, but we know again the correlation between education and wealth, IQ and wealth, are most likely engaging in planning-like activities. Okay, so they hire or consult with the financial planner, they calculate need, they use computer programs and are reading relevant information related to the topics that they're pursuing. Okay, so very linear positive relationships associated with these things. All right, so the rich seek financial advice. Okay, and for the reason being, they have the highest demand, right? Greater wealth equals a greater benefit from quality decisions. Okay, now on the flip side of that, there is a counter argument that greater wealth grows at a more rapid rate and produces more resource availability for pursuit of goals, and therefore benefits from quality decision making more. From a marginal utility of consumption perspective, I would say the exact opposite, right? If I'm achieving marginal utility at a level 1, right, a little bit of financial advice might take me from level 1 to level 10 in one piece of advice, right? We just think about the mortgage market for a first-time home buyer. If you get crappy advice on what mortgage to use based on your circumstances in that home purchase transaction, that could have a diminishing effect, a large diminishing effect on your utility. If you make what would appear to most people as a pretty good decision, right? That's pretty intuitive. That's what I would have done. But for that consumer that has less experience, less sophistication, whatever the case may be, good advice on mortgage can jump their marginal utility massively from that perspective. Now, it doesn't impact their wealth in a significant way. But because resources are so limited, the marginal utility that they experience greatly. Again, this speaks to why this group loves financial advice and is willing to pay for it, because they know that greater information, even though costly, will be beneficial over time. This speaks to the benefit of regulation for people that may not be able to afford quality financial advice, because putting constraints on how the market can take advantage of the unsophisticated can have massive impacts on the level of marginal utility they achieve from one state versus another. Okay, so again, there's a lot of parallels to information and advice and regulation, right? Information and advice is going to be heavily demanded and valued by wealthier, more sophisticated people. Regulation is going to be heavily demanded by the naive. And I would say the exact opposite would be true when we look at the two groups in the other thing, right? The sophisticated really don't like regulation very much, right? And the naive don't care that much about information because they don't see it as value. That's kind of why we see this. Okay. Now, when we're looking at how demand impacts supply, well, if the wealthy demand because it has a greater impact on their wealth, then the supply providing financial advice are going to go to those that have the greatest demand. Okay, and they're going to charge accordingly based on the needs and the complexity of their class.
Professor, on the demand side, are we looking at this is an equilibrium analysis? Are you saying are we looking at total wealth or marginal benefit from the additional dollar you make as a result of being exposed to advice I don't know whether I heard you right, because if you are doing the marginal analysis, if you have a greater wealth, you get exposed to advice, whatever additional dollar you get there is not going to yield so much of additional utility to you as somebody
Yeah,
who is at a lower level. So what yardstick are we?
we're looking at total wealth.
Okay,
Yeah.
thank you.
Yeah, so, and I'll put dollars to it, right?
Yeah.
If I get bad investment advice and I'm wealthy, then it costs me $500,000,
Okay.
right?
Yeah.
If I get good investment advice, it may be worth $2 million worth of
Right.
benefit over my lifetime.
Yeah.
Right?
Thank you.
On the flip side, if I have no wealth and I get bad wealth advice, it might cost me $3,000. If I get good advice, I may gain 10, but it's not that. The magnitude of that's not that much. Now, to your point, the 10 gain from quality advice from the lower wealth individual may provide more utility than the 2 million gain on the wealthier side of the equation. But we're looking at total.
Oh.
All right, so here's a pretty good illustration demonstrating that not everybody demands financial advice. Okay, so looking at bank consumers in Germany, they're offered no cost, high quality, independent financial advice. Only 5% accepted the free advice through their bank. And we're going to talk about another thing that comes into play. But what we can assume at some level, and the authors talk about this in this research, is that not everyone demands information at the same level, right? And if we don't demand information, then we're not going to pursue information because we don't believe that the benefit of information is greater than the cost. Okay? Now, the other thing that comes into play is if a bank comes to you and says, hey, listen, we're going to give you free financial advice. Like, what do you want from me? Right? Nothing comes for free. This is too good to be true. I don't trust you. We have a trust issue in the advice marketplace. Now, this wasn't the point of this paper, but I think it deserves a sidebar. In the market for financial advice, there is a trust issue. We're going to talk about in one of our later lectures a really good paper that was written by Akerlof in 1970 titled A Market for Limits. And this paper is about the used car industry. It's not about the used car industry. They use the used car industry as the example to illustrate the theoretical concepts in the paper. Okay. Now, the bad news is it applies really nicely to the financial advice market as well. Where there's distrust, there's a lack of demand. And where there's a lack of demand, there's a lack of use, even when it could be beneficial to the people that it's being made available to. Okay, so who was more likely to accept the advice? For the most part, the people that we would expect, the people that had more at stake. Okay, so the wealthy, the older, who are also probably wealthier, and those that were less behavioral, right? Those are more objective, rational decision makers with their money. Now, men, we might say, I don't know anything about the cultural dynamics of Germany, for what that's worth. But this was written in 2011, which wasn't a millennium ago, but you might say in this culture that men might have been the more dominant individuals in the household that were responsible for these types of decisions. And so when the non-dominant financial decision maker was asked, they might have said, it's not my decision to make. That's the where the men might have been more responsible for that role. Okay. So then we provide some explanations out of the paper, right? Makes sense for the wealthy because of the fixed time costs of getting the advice, and again, the more sophisticated are more likely.
But why, if you go back real fast, why, maybe I'm missing something, if only 5% accepted the free advice, where do you think the other 30-something% of the wealthy in the prior slides, like who accepts financial advice, as you get into the quintiles, where did the other 30% go then? You're saying because of trust issues? Or
I mean, that would be a potential explanation. In this particular case, It might have been because they already are receiving advice from someone else. Yeah, it might, there could be a variety.
Okay, yeah, okay, that makes sense.
All right. So when we really think about the purpose of this class, that was all just throwing down the book you stuff. Understanding the basics of economic policy analysis, understanding the theory related to financial advice. Understand how we justify regulating the advice market, how it's currently regulated, and opportunities for improvements. Right? Anytime, and let's just go back to the theory that we laid out on the front side of this. Right? We basically said, hey, listen, there are rational people, right? Theoretically speaking. And these rational people have full information, the ability to use that information, and then they use it to make fully rational decisions, right? So their outcomes are optimal. Okay. Anytime we see an observation that rubs against that theoretical setup, then we ask ourselves, what is the interference that's causing the discrepancy, right? And then if we can identify the interference, then the next question is, how do we deal with that interference? Okay, and it's not always regulation, by the way, but in some cases it is. And so we want to understand, right? Is there an opportunity from a regulatory perspective to offset the negative impacts of an interference so that less utility is lost for the consumer? And if there is, that's awesome. Now, oftentimes, if there is a theoretical opportunity to accomplish that objective, there's probably a regulation that's already in place. And so our next job is to come in and say, how is that regulation functioning to optimize according to its objective? And more often than not, there are opportunities for improvement. Okay, and so now we can say, all right, regulation will be beneficial. Then we can say, here's what current regulation is doing. How is current regulation falling short? And what might we do differently to improve outcomes through a regulatory adjustment? So this is kind of fun to look at from that perspective. And it really helps you understand why people interact with financial advice, why they may choose not to, how they interact, their successes, their failures, how we can help improve those outcomes, and what our missed opportunities are, and how those things can be improved upon moving forward.
To phrase it in my own words about the layout you have here, are we focusing on only advice here, or the direct impact of policy on the naive? I think my understanding of the setup here is that we have an optimal solution. Yeah, there are people out there who don't have the capacity to achieve that optimal solution. We think the solution is the advisor in between. Yeah, so how does regulation come in to ensure that the advisor does the best thing? Yeah, are we looking at how policy operates through the advisor to the naive consumer, or are we also looking at the direct impact of policy on the naive consumer minus without taking into consideration the advice?
Both.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, and a bunch of others too. But yeah, I mean, I think that you know, thinking through both of those perspectives, I think when we get through this class, you'll be able to say, oh yeah, I feel a lot better about understanding both of those things. Yeah. All right, so some policy basics. Okay. Now we're kind of talking about policy in and of itself, and when it makes sense and when it doesn't make sense.
I don't know. I want to ask this before you go to that. You talk a lot about theory, but practitioners out there are not comfortable with theory. I don't know what you have to say.
Yeah.
Because we have to know the optimal solution. I am for theory. It gives us the optimal possible solution, and so that we can see the deviations and try to correct them. But I understand practitioners are not fans of theoretical models, they don't like it
Yeah.
because they tend to be complex. So I think there is a missing link there. I don't know.
Yeah, I think a couple of things, right? I think practitioners, if a practitioner was taking this course, which we have a few. I think one of the things that you'll be able to walk away with is, oh, like I have a better understanding of why my client does what they do, right? And I'll also have a better understanding for why regulation has stepped in and created some of these compliance headaches for me. Now, either you might say, okay, I get it, like that makes me less mad about having to go through this compliance process because I understand the benefits of it at the end of the day. And it actually makes me more valuable and demanded in the marketplace because of the benefits of regulation. We'll talk more about that. I don't want to spoil that still. It'll also help the practitioner be like, man, this regulation sucks and this is why it's not helping us out at all. Or if I was to pursue this topic based on my perspective and interactions with clients, then I think I might be able to propose a better solution. I can show how it produces a better outcome for the individual receiving advice, and I can show how it more efficiently does so as well. Okay, so it'll be less about this is how I advise my client, and more about this is how the market operates. And if you take a step back from that actual client interaction, really understanding the regulatory environment, its impact on the outcomes that people have, the impact it has on the demand for the profession, and ultimately how we engage with and move the profession forward in a meaningful way. Does that answer your question?
Yes.
Okay, good. All right, so households cooperate to form groups. Okay, and so people that want the same things oftentimes come together. So theoretically speaking, we could say that everyone wants utility maximization. They just achieve it differently, right? And that's a good thing. And as we'll talk about over the course of the semester, is this going to present some real challenges as well? Okay. So, but households that are rowing the boat in the same direction because they want the same things, organize so that they can control or manipulate the marketplace, right? I want to make sure that the outcome that I desire is more likely through the efforts that I'm engaging in. Okay. Now, if we call this a government, right? Think back to the early settlers in the United States, which doesn't apply great because some of you guys are international, but right. People came to the US, they organized to create a government that they believed aligned with the best interest and betterment of the society as a whole, right? Because that's what we're doing, right? We're organizing to control the marketplace for the overall betterment of society. Okay, so we're willing to pay taxes, so that the SEC exists to monitor advisors, to limit their ability to take advantage of their consumers or their customers. Okay, that's good. We all want that. We want less ability of advisors to take advantage of us. The advisor is the sophisticated, the customer is the naive. Okay, they understand more about the products, the process, the compensation, the outcomes. And so with that sophistication, they have an opportunity and an incentive to take advantage of the naive. And so the SEC steps in and says, hey, listen, we're going to monitor this action. We're going to put regulatory requirements in place to ensure that there are consequences to negative behavior. It always sounds so bad. Just by the way, I'm going to say that financial advisors have a lot of incentive to do bad things. A lot this class. And so for you guys that are practitioners, I'm not saying you're bad people. I'm saying that we're all humans, right? And one of the things that I think is apparently true about the human race is that we're self-interested. Everybody's like, I'm not self-interested. I wish I could say I wasn't self-interested. I really do. I would love to have that characteristic. The reality is, based on our innate nature, I think humans have proven themselves, on the average, to be self-interested beings. And so, if we're self-interested, then that puts an obvious conflict of interest in place, right? So any opportunity and incentive I have to better my self-interest, I will take, even if it's at the expense of another. All right, so again, don't take that personally. Okay, so what this society is going to do is they're going to take scarce resources, pool them to create more utility than what they would have been able to accomplish on their own. Okay, that is the tax system, right? When Lubbock comes in and says, hey, listen, we want to pass a bond to improve the roads in town, and that bond passes for whatever number of millions of dollars it is, and people are going to have to pay the taxes to fund that bond to improve the roads in the community. What they're saying is that collectively, we're willing to do that because it's cheaper to do this as a group than it is to do it on our own, and we all want it for the most part. Now, not 100% of people agree with that, but if more do than don't, then we're elevating the utility of society as a whole. We're providing more benefit than we are cost on the average. Okay? Without organization, this would be very difficult to accomplish. All right, so this sounds negative. Don't read what it's not. So policy is collective action involving coercive power of government, right? I want to direct the outcomes of decisions, right? We see this all the time. We collectively elect government officials because we believe that those are the people that are going to make decisions that are in line with our preferences, right? And the more people that agree with one person than another, that person becomes the person that influences decision making and outcome. Okay, so we're coercing what the government does, right? At some level by engaging in this activity. And so we just got to recognize what it is. So, like I said, our job as scientists is to describe interference with markets, predict responses to those interferences based on empirical evidence and theory, consider alternatives, investigate the response to those alternatives, and produce the best solution. Okay. All right, last slide for today, right? As scientists, especially as we talk about regulation, one of the things that may fog our approach to this are our own personal biases, our own personal preferences, right? Well, one of the credos of the scientist is that I'm going to approach this from an unbiased perspective. I'm going to let the process guide my thinking. I'm going to let theory guide my thinking, and the results will be what they are, and I will observe those results objectively. All right, so scientists do not allow biases to guide their analysis. They focus on valid empirical evidence from prior research and their own results. They use theory to guide their thinking, not their preferences or desires. They avoid anecdotal examples. And when the research based on the analysis suggests a controversial decision, they present it objectively. Right? They present it objectively. You see this quite a bit, right? And this is why research is oftentimes ahead of industry, regardless of what industry we're in, right? Research is almost always ahead of industry. Even in academics, where academics move at the pace of an elderly snail, right? So slow. It's still ahead of industry and informs the next step that industry is going to take. So it's really fun to listen to quality research or to read quality research and stay on top of the topic of interest, because when you do that, oftentimes what you see is this lag effect 2, 3, 4, 5 years later, where the things that you're reading about come into practice in some context. And so, at the time, it's controversial. As time passes, a lot of times it becomes the norm. So don't be afraid to bump up against what's currently taking place because it's advancing the body of knowledge. And again, don't let biases affect the interpretation of what you publish, especially in a policy-based research, but it applies to any type of research. All right, folks. I think we got into a pretty good overview of kind of what this class is going to look like, the type of things that we're going to be discussing in the next 4 lectures. Do you have any questions for me going into tomorrow?
So just have the readings done before tomorrow and.
Yep. Yeah, so just look, and hopefully, did everybody get the link to Dropbox and you can see all the readings and no issues in terms of that? Sometimes I'm nervous that those things are gonna not pull up or not download or not link. But yeah, let me know if you're having any issues there. So yeah, if you got a chance to read today's, awesome. If you didn't, read for understanding. Today's and tomorrow's, and we'll continue with our discussion.
So, which of the readings should we focus on for tomorrow? Is it a? I think you have 7 folders in there. So which one should we focus on for tomorrow?
Yeah, so I think it's, are they labeled like day 1, day 2, day 3?
Yeah, 1, 2.
Yeah, so it'd be 2.
Oh,
So, yeah, information economics.
Yeah.
oh,
And where will your this recording be posted at?
I will, let me pull up Blackboard real quick and I'll show you. Yeah. So we have these lecture materials.
Yep.
And so we have PowerPoints and you're seeing my view, not yours. But I'll have just a folder under PowerPoints and lecture materials for Blackboard. Let's record a lecture for this summer.
Perfect. Thank you.
for the comms, what does this course come in? Do you have a section where you also set your own questions from what the questions that will be set under economic theory? How does that work for the comms?
I'm not sure I understand the question.
So I want to know. So this is regulatory policy, and we have economic theory, household economic theory. We're taking, and I am taking it with Professor Heckman.
Yeah.
And structuring the comms, the comprehensive exam.
Okay.
Do you come together to
Oh, yeah.
put it together?
Right.
Or will you have your section? Professor Heckman will have his section. Professor Lacombe, I know he will.
Yeah, we have our own sections.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so it wouldn't be like apply the concepts of household economic theory and integrate it with the concepts of regulatory policy in this crazy big question.
Oh.
You would have a theory section of the qualifying exam, and in that you'd have some household economic questions, you'd have some financial planning theory questions, you'd have some regulatory policy questions.
Oh.
Yeah, it'll be clear what to play.
Oh. Thank you.
Any other questions?
Can you use that for presentations or do we pick the papers?
I will randomly assign you papers and presentation dates. I have a very sophisticated process. I write your names on little pieces of paper, put them in a cup, and draw them out. And number 1 gets the first paper that's listed on the syllabus. Number 2 gets the second paper, and so on and so forth. I will post that by the end of the day tomorrow, so that you guys have the weekend if you want to go ahead and get started deconstructing your paper and preparing for your presentation. You know what the paper you're presenting on.
Will you time the final exam?
No, I will not time it.
Oh.
Hey, I do want to show you something really quick. Your syllabus that I posted on Blackboard is different than the one that I sent through email. Again, this is a crazy time of year for all of us. And so I just want to make sure on the schedule side of things that you're aware. Obviously this is the day, check, tomorrow, I'll see you here, we'll do this. Friday, we have our PFP graduation and all that kind of stuff like that. I'm gonna pre-record Friday's lecture. Okay, so you'll just watch Friday's lecture without coming to class on Friday. The exact same thing for Monday of next week. You'll have a recorded lecture for Monday of next week. Previously, Friday wasn't going to be recorded, and Tuesday was. Tuesday, we will meet in class. And I'll remind you of this again. I just want you to see this. Tuesday, we will meet. I'll answer any questions that you had from the previously recorded lectures for Friday and Monday. We'll cover our Tuesday content, and then we'll go over the midterm exam so that you feel well equipped to go into this exam and be successful. That sound good? All right. Well, glad to have you all. Appreciate your time and attention today. Thanks for being flexible. We will be here tomorrow at 9 a.m. For class numero dos.
Will we do midterm one in class, you're saying, or no?
No.
That's not. Oh,
Yeah, we take on as well.
that's right.
Yeah.
You'll